On the 6th of January 1066, Edward the Confessor died. He died without an heir. And as if that wasn't bad enough, not only does he die without an heir, he then gets blamed for not having an heir to the throne. And a lot of historians will label him as a bad king. And it's not so much the historians, so much as people who have that little bit of understanding of history, and they will like to kind of harp on the fact that Edward the Confessor was a bad king, no kids, chaos, 3 battles, all his fault. And I'm here to say that that's not entirely true. It's not entirely fair, and I'm here to defend Edward the Confessor, so here we go. Firstly, let me just say that what I'm going to talk about specifically here is not Edward the Confessor as an overall legacy, because there are things that we should and can criticise Edward the Confessor for. His over-reliance on the Godwins, the fact that he told the name escapes me, but essentially he was like burned down over, you know, he wasn't as, well, he is technically a saint, but he wasn't like never did anything wrong kind of saint. Like, he was a human being, and even though he was later canonized and all that jazz, he was still a human being and made plenty of mistakes. So I'm not really going to talk about specifically those. I'm going to keep very much focused on his role in the chaos of 1066, okay? Firstly, he died. I don't think we can really blame him for that. Happens to the best of us. But what I will say is that we need to really think about why so many people are happy to say that he was a bad king, because he didn't settle the succession. And I would argue, humbly, that the reason that people are so excited by he was a bad king, he didn't settle the succession, you know, he should have had some kids, he should have blah, 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 blah. A lot of the reason, I would say, that people talk a lot about this is because of the fact that when we think about the medieval time period, people will put onto it the later medieval time period. And if you take the later time period, if you do not have an heir to the throne, yeah, big problem, potential, you know, civil war, War of the Roses. Obviously Elizabeth I got a lot of slack for not having an heir, so completely justified. But that was a much later time period. In the early medieval time period, post-conquest, the way that monarchs succeeded the throne was different. And it is not fair to criticise Edward the Confessor by the standards of a 15th century king compared to a 10th century king. They were just living in completely different worlds, okay? Yes, post-conquest, England certainly does follow the much more sort of continental sort of Salian law when it came down to succession, which is that the eldest son would inherit the throne or the estate or whatever it was, okay? And post-conquest, that pretty much always happened. There are a couple of exceptions, and that typically happened a little bit sort of sooner on. So one of the key exceptions is, William the Conqueror himself. You know, it wasn't his eldest son that became King of England so much as one of his younger sons, William Rufus. And then you've also got Henry I. He chose his daughter to succeed the throne, and obviously that led to the whole anarchy, which is a fascinating topic for a different video. So there were definitely exceptions where it didn't quite go that particular way. But before the conquest, 1066, it's not really the king who has that power. Sure, he's important, and what the king wants plays a role, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Not the same way that it would be the be-all and end-all when you're talking about like the 16th century or the 14th century. 10th century, 11th century, things were different, and it wasn't the king who got that final decision. It was, in fact, the Witan. I always imagine the Witan to be like a group of like older men with like really long beards, like a whole room full of like Gandalfs. That's, you know, like think like unseen university kind of like wizards. It's just how I always imagine them, but maybe not. The Witan was the king's council and very much derives its name from this idea of kind of like the wise men. Their job and their responsibility was to advise the king, and when the king dies, they were very much responsible for the succession. It was their kind of job, like one of their most important qualities, and it doesn't get talked about a lot, but that was one of their key things that they had to do. The Witan had to elect a king, and in 1066 they actually do that. Okay, they do it, gosh, how many times? 3 times. They do it 3 times. They elect a king 3 times. Harold Godwinson, following the death of Edward the Confessor, who again crowns himself the next day, which definitely isn't a sign of insecurity, Mr. Godwinson, but here we are. Then they go for Edgar Atheling. They crown, well, they don't actually crown him, but they kind of say, yeah, you can be king. And then very, very quickly they change their mind because William the Conqueror was like conquering. So they then changed their mind very, very quickly, and then did the formal election of William, and then William actually gets coronated. So Edward the Atheling never actually becomes properly king, but there is a brief time where he has been selected by the Witan. So that was probably a big day for him. Anyway, I digress. So what qualities would the Witan put onto their, I mean, I don't do online dating, but what would be like their wish list? What would they want on their kind of like dating profile? Ideally, they want them to be related to the king, okay? It's not like they have to be related to the king, but that is a pretty big, you know, tick in the box. So ideally, some kind of relation to a previous monarch is a big bonus. Secondly, big army, okay? Big army, big wealth, you know, all the money, all the jazz, all the support, okay? So somebody who has got the ability to have that military prowess, that reputation, and that group of people around them as well, okay? So that kind of like, you know, Harold Godwinson fits that. I mean, aside from losing the Battle of Hastings, but Harold Godwinson kind of fits that category really, really well because he was the richest man in England by that point. He had a really, really impressive network of people who were very much supporting of him, and he had spent a good amount of time building up alliances with a lot of those other sort of noblemen, with a lot of those other kind of like key figures within England at the time. So there was that. And then, of course, you have got who is endorsing them. You know, endorsements are a big thing, and they were a big thing then. Do they have political important figures who are backing them? And this is perhaps one of the important things, is does the previous king choose them? And it's the king's choice thing that which could get Edward the Confessor into some sticky water. Like, I completely concede that there's a possibility that he may have screwed up there, but you know, stick with me, okay? We'll see. So what I thought would be kind of like, just to kind of like prove my point that the Witan are the ones that ultimately get that control, I thought if we go back in time, like the past 6 monarchs before Edward, you can get a good sense of the different motivations that can lead towards a king being selected. And then we will kind of deviate from there as and when we need to. So, and I'm going to check the date, 975, Edgar the Peaceful dies. I'm not gonna lie, I don't really remember the details, but he dies. Now, he has at this point in time 2 pretty young sons, okay? He has got Edward and he has got Ethelred. And both of those children are from different mothers. The reason that's important is because when we talk about who chooses who, one of the things that Ethelred's mother is going to say quite a lot is that Edward is illegitimate, and that is a reason for him to not inherit the throne. So that is definitely going to be a conversation. Now, we don't know the exact ages of these children, but we do know that they were young. And following the death of Edgar the Peaceful, there is this issue, and a lot of those sort of like, you know, a lot of the royal courts are very much divided between who should become king. Now, for Edward, who was the older of the 2, he is essentially selected because the royal court is divided. Both of these children have got people that were backing them. They have got, I mean, particularly for Ethelred, he's got his mother. He's also got important figures as well, that are like bishops and things that are supporting him too. So he's got that. Edward also has people that are selecting him. The Witan eventually chooses Edward because of the fact that he's a little bit older, and again, he's got those powerful connections within the royal court. So ultimately, they decide that Edward was the choice because he was a bit older and he had those powerful people, and he was the son of the king. So, you know, lots of good reasons there to choose Edward. However, Edward is murdered. What a surprise. Murdered, and then it is at that point they go to their second choice, which was the younger son Ethelred, who will later become known as Ethelred the Unready, essentially just meaning like ill counsel or ill ruled or whatever. So he then becomes king. Now Ethelred is really young at this point. We don't know the exact age, possibly maybe 7, maybe a bit older, but he is a very, very young king at this point in time. And again, he's very much selected because he has got those people around him who were very supportive of him. Then we've got Canute. Canute is conquest, all about the conquest. He has led an extensive military campaign. By this point, one of the, the only real kind of adult-ish son at this point, Edmund, briefly is selected by the Witan, but is very, very quickly defeated, so does not actually kind of get any grace around him. Canute is selected by the Witan simply because of the fact that he had a bigger army, and they were like, okay, fine, be king of England. So following the death of Canute, we then have Harold Harefoot, who was king, again, for a brief period of time. There are some concerns and some questions about whether or not he is the choice. Similar to when Edgar the Peaceful died, there are some divisions about who should be selected as king. Ultimately, they do go for Harold Harefoot, and again, it's a similar thing. He's the son of a king, and he is the older of them, despite the fact that Harthacnut was the son of Emma, who was the Queen of England, both when she was married to Canute, and also she was also married to Ethelred as well. So she's again very much trying to delegitimize Harthacnut. Didn't work. The Witan still chose the elder son because you don't want, if you are sensible, you do not want to have children on the throne, because it is going to lead to a period of instability unless they have got powerful figures around them and good guiding forces around them as well to try and keep them nice and stable. So Harthacnut rules for about 2 years, and then it is at that point that there is an Edward over in Normandy who has been growing up, and he was a son of Ethelred the Unready. So he is essentially a person who by this point had spent a lot of time kind of preparing, building up alliances, building up his reputation so that he would be able to kind of like come back to England and be selected as king. And there was a huge amount of rejoicing when Edward came back, and Edward leaned into the propaganda of it as well, making sure that he was coronated on Easter. I think it was Easter Sunday, but he was coronated, and there's a lot of this idea of like rebirth and a lot of huge emphasis on the fact that this was the old king's line coming back. So again, the Witan made a choice there to kind of go back to the previous family tree, because that was just sort of like an established king line, so they need to bring it back, or at least that was what the argument was. So with all of those different cases, you have slightly different elements that are participating. Generally, they are going to try and choose somebody who is the son of a king, but they will also go for somebody who has got that military prowess, that's somebody who is related to the previous monarch. The Wessex thing is great, but not essential, hence why, you know, they weren't begging for Edward to come back when Harthacnut was like right there and Harold Harefoot was right there. That wasn't what they were wanting to do. So when you take all of this together, it's why the selection of Harold Godwinson is actually not that it's not that surprising. And a lot of us are going to look at Harold Godwinson and think, yeah, he was, I mean, let's be honest, there are some shady things. For instance, Edward says on his deathbed, and you know, the only people that are there that are all kind of like Harold's people, Harold's advisors, yeah, it does seem shady. Did Edward actually choose him to be king? But here's the thing, even if Edward didn't, he still could have been selected by the Witan to be king, because the Witan were the ones that ultimately had the power. I mean, it's good for Harold that Edward apparently chose him, because it gives his claim to the throne more legitimacy. But again, he ticks a lot of the boxes. He was the most powerful person in England and had very much been running the country essentially, particularly in Edward's later years. As Edward got older, he became a lot more reliant on Harold Godwinson to run the country effectively. So is it that surprising that the Witten, who are always looking to continue with continuity of that family line, are going to look at Harold, who's been running things, and think, well, he's done a great job already. He has hundreds of children, it seems like. Let's go with him. Oh, and also, completely forgot, he was also related through marriage because his sister Edith was married to the king. So there's that family relationship there as well. So, yeah, it makes sense, even if he didn't name him on his deathbed, which, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I have questions. Sorry, Harold, but I do have questions. But what about the choice of the king? So, how important was that? Well, the thing is, in 1066, it's all about who Edward chose. That's the thing that everyone comes back to. And kind of forgetting that actually the Witten were the ones that would make that ultimate choice because the king's dead, so what's he going to do about it? You know, it's the Witten that get to make that choice. They have to see that process through. But Edward did have a choice. And William will have you believe that it was William. And the Norman sources report this extensively. Now, a lot of English historians completely dismiss or ignore the Norman sources. Mark Morris puts forward a really good case for the idea that in moments of desperation, when Edward was looking for allies, could have made the suggestion to William that he would name him as his heir. Possibly. And I can't dispute that. And if Edward did indeed do that, then he should have probably seen that through or sent like a breakup letter to William to say, I've changed my mind. Because I think even if at the beginning of the early sort of 1050s, Edward is still putting out messages. Who is he looking for? Well, he's looking for relatives. Because when his dad, Ethelred, died, and you've got the Viking invasion, and you've got Edmund, who very briefly kind of is leading that defence against the Vikings and loses and dies, Edmund Ironside had children, 2 sons in particular. One of them was called Edward, I think the other one was called Edmund. Edmund doesn't last long, like he isn't reported a lot in the historical records. We don't really know what happened to Edmund. If his name was Edmund, I really hope it is and I'm not misremembering it. But Edward, the child of Edmund the Ironside, or Edmund Ironside, ends up being sort of spirited away and reappears late in the historical records in the Kievan Rus, potentially in Hungary, apparently kind of goes via sort of Sweden and ends up in the court of Yaroslav the Wise in the Kievan Rus and ends up in Hungary in the mid-1050s. So there are reports that Edward is sending out messages because he has heard these rumours that he'll be his nephew is alive, and sends people, including, by the way, Harold Godwinson, to go and bring Edward back so that Edward the Exile can be named Atheling. So my question is, Edward was clearly trying to solve the problem of succession, and this is why, personally, I have doubts about whether or not Edward actually did promise William the throne. The only thing that I can think of is maybe they got like drunk or something and Edward kind of said like, oh, I might name you as heir or something, and William just got the wrong end of the stick. Or more likely, because there were people who were supporting the Norman sort of side of things particularly within London, so I have no problem that those individuals were like, well, you know what? Doesn't look like him and Edith are going to have children, so I think you could be his heir. You've got that connection. You are somewhat related. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised by that either. Mark Morris certainly doesn't think that William the Conqueror just sort of like woke up on a whim and was like, I want to be King of England. Like, Morris puts forward that William genuinely believed that he had been chosen. Now, whether or not Edward actually chose him is a separate thing and is much more controversial. And I would argue that I don't personally think he did. And the reason that I don't think he did is because Edward's actions throughout the 1050s seem to be that he is looking for his heir. And he seems to be looking in his own family tree, as in the House of Wessex. So calls back Edmund the Exile, who eventually does start to come back and mysteriously dies as soon as he steps foot in England. Just saying. However, Edward the Exile did have children. He had 3 children. He had Margaret, Christina, and Edgar. Edgar was like a child at this point. He will have been very, very little. Now, once Edward the Exile dies, those children do not leave England. They stay in England and they are kind of raised within the court of Edward. Now, this is one of the things that I think is important. Edgar never seemed to really get much of the reputation from the other adults, but Edward the Confessor was certainly seeming to put forward that he should be king. He was named as the Eighthling. He was treated as a prince. He was given education as though he was going to be the next king. And certainly, following the death of Edward the Exile, Edward the Confessor almost kind of like adopts him as sort of kind of like his son or his relation. And Tom Licence here, this book, really recommend this book, really, really good. It's Edward the Confessor, puts forward a really compelling case for why Edward the Confessor had actually made a selection, but he had selected his young nephew, like his great nephew, Edgar, sorry. Oh, there's so many Edwards. Edgar the Eighthling. So, did Edward the Confessor try to solve the succession problem? I would say yes. Was that his responsibility alone? No, the Witten were the ones that were going to make the choice. Why didn't they want to go with Edgar? Well, by the time that Edward the Confessor dies, he's not particularly old. He's, 13, 14 by this point, and we have seen how the Witten will choose the elder of the candidates. And Edgar did not have that same kind of level of endorsement. His mother Agatha is not very well respected within the records. We know very little about her. She does not come across at all in the records, so historians assume that she is sort of very much a figure happy or pushed into the background. You know, maybe she didn't speak English very much. You know, maybe she didn't make those connections. Maybe she was really powerful and just hasn't been included in any of the records, which absolutely could be a thing. There are a lot of questions, but I don't think it's fair to say that the chaos of 1066 is just Edward the Confessor's fault. There are a multitude of factors, a multitude of people who are moving for their own gain. And I think when it comes down to succession, I think Edward the Confessor tried his best. He clearly failed. But it wasn't that he didn't care and did nothing. He tried. Anyway, thank you so much for getting to the end of this video. Thank you so much. How many times can I say thank you in like 30 seconds? Probably quite a lot. But anyway, thank you. You made it to the end. So just feel free to just drop me a like, comment, you know, give me any sort of feedback. I'm particularly interested in terms of what you think. Am I being too generous towards Edward the Confessor? Or perhaps should we blame other people for 1066? And yeah, maybe Tostig will be a video coming soon in the future. We'll see. Anyway, have a great one. Bye!